Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, book by book. In this episode, we continue exploring Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society by unpacking the enduring debate over nature versus nurture and why claims of biological destiny often say more about society than science.
That's a really interesting way to put it, isn't it? Because, when we get down to nature versus nurture, especially with gender, the big question is, well, how much do biological differences really explain the gender differences? And maybe more importantly, the inequalities that we see.
Right, and also, what is this constant search, this intense focus sometimes on finding biological reasons? What does that tell us about our society, our culture?
Yeah, maybe even about a deep down wish to believe some things are just set in stone,
Right.
biologically determined.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're really focusing in on excerpts from Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society. He does such a good job right at the start explaining why these biological explanations are just so darn persuasive for so many people. They just feel sort of right.
Oh, absolutely. There's a definite intuitive pull. It sounds like real science, based on objective facts. And let's be honest, it often seems to line up with what we think we see every day. Men and women do seem different sometimes.
It feeds into that whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of thinking.
Right, and there's a conceptual tidiness to it, almost comforting. If all the social stuff we see, including the inequalities, is just a natural result of biology, well then the way things are is just natural. It's how it's supposed to be.
And that thinking has huge implications, doesn't it? It kind of lets everyone off the hook. If it's all just biology, it's biological, then who's really to blame for inequality?
Exactly. And Kimmel points out how this logic gets used by different groups, sometimes in surprising ways. Conservatives might use it to defend tradition, sure, but sometimes feminists use it to argue for unique female strengths, or others use it to push back against change. It also implies that, well, big political changes, social programs, policy shifts, maybe they can't fundamentally change things if the roots are in biology.
Okay, so that sets up our mission for this deep dive then. We're going to really dig into some of the main biological arguments used to explain sex differences and inequality based on the source material.
But not just listing them. Crucially, we'll also look, like Kimmel does, at what this whole search for biological answers tells us about our culture's tendency, maybe even desire, to believe in biological destiny.
Okay, let's get into it. The idea that biology dictates social roles, it's not new. But who was doing the explaining changed quite a bit.
Yeah, before the 19th century, it was mostly theologians, right? They were the authorities.
Right. They framed it all through God's plan. God made man and woman different for different purposes, those reproductive differences, seen as totally decisive for what men and women should do.
The source gives that example of Reverend John Todd railing against women's suffrage. He literally said it would reverse the very laws of God, pulling women out of their proper sphere.
Wow. But then, late 19th century, things shifted. Darwin comes along, evolutionary biology explodes, and scientists really step into that role of explaining gender.
And they started using the language of science, biology, to make these really specific claims about what women could and couldn't do.
Like Dr. W.C. Taylor in 1871, his book basically treated menstruation like a major illness. He advised women to stay home for 5 or 6 days every month, avoid anything strenuous, long walks, dancing, parties.
The whole argument was, fundamentally, that women's biology just made them unfit for public life, for work, for school, for politics. Just not built for it.
And Darwin himself, even as he was revolutionizing biology, wasn't free from the assumptions of his time. Origin of Species was about natural selection, adaptation.
But then in The Descent of Man, when he applied it to humans, he described women as different mainly in having greater tenderness and lesser selfishness, whereas men, their competitiveness, ambition, selfishness, that was their natural and unfortunate birthright.
And he flat out said men would achieve higher eminence
Yeah.
in pretty much anything compared to women.
So these ideas, often based on, frankly, pretty shaky evidence or interpretations, they got stamped as scientific fact.
And that fact became a powerful tool to shut down any challenges to social inequality. When wanting the vote, wanting jobs, higher education, that was framed as totally misguided, unnatural, going against the laws of nature.
Or sometimes the argument was flipped. Women should be exempted from these tough things men had to deal with because of their delicate nature, their biological limits.
That quote from the 1880 Sacramento debate is pretty stark. This person argued against suffrage because of the burden it would place on a woman's delicate nature, her slender frame, the constant strain of her biology.
Yeah, claiming mental effort could cause actual diseases and that having ambition or passion was just too potent for women, leading to wrecked health and early death. It's like a whole catalog of biological excuses.
And it wasn't just biologists saying this. Social scientists were eager to get in on it, too.
Oh, yeah, the social Darwinists are a classic example. They took Darwin's ideas and, well, kind of twisted them, applying natural selection way beyond species over millennia. They applied it to races, nations, families, sexes, and on a timescale like 1 or 2 generations.
Trying to make social science seem more legitimate, maybe. Grounding it in natural law.
Seems like it. You get figures like Gustave Le Bon, a French sociologist, making these just astonishing claims in 1879. He said women's brains were closer to gorillas than developed male brains.
Gorillas?
Seriously. He called women the most inferior forms of human evolution, similar to children and savages, only good at things like being fickle, illogical, unable to reason. Any impressive woman was just a monstrosity, an exception.
Wow. And a lot of this debate focused specifically on educating women, right? Letting them go to college.
Huge battleground. The claims were wild, that average women could only handle academics by sacrificing their health, their emotions, their morals.
And the source mentions that truly bizarre idea. If women went to college, their brains would physically get bigger and heavier, but their uteruses would actually shrink.
Yeah, Edward C. Clarke, a Harvard professor, really pushed this in his 1873 book, Sex and Education. He argued women had to be exempted because of reproduction, predicting college women wouldn't have kids, and America would have to import wives from Europe.
And that brings in that other layer. The source mentions the mixing of sexism and racism, fears about immigrants out-reproducing native-born whites.
Definitely playing on those anxieties. And the evidence they used was often just correlational data spun politically. Sure, college-educated women married less and had fewer kids back then.
But blaming shriveled uteruses instead of, maybe expanded opportunities and choices.
Exactly. Or that statistic about mental institutions. 42% of women inmates were college-educated versus 16% of men, instead of seeing that as maybe, just maybe, frustrated ambitions or societal limits causing distress.
They blamed college itself for driving women crazy. The interpretation always fit the assumption.
It really shows the underlying conservatism baked into these arguments throughout history. They prop up existing power structures. James Long's quote is just brutally direct about it. How did woman become subject to man? By her nature, her sex, just as the Negro is and always will be, inferior to the white race.
Ooh. Directly linking gender and racial hierarchy as natural, unavoidable facts. And we still hear echoes of it. The source brings up Newt Gingrich in the 90s, arguing against women in combat roles because of biological problems staying in a ditch for 30 days, lack of upper body strength.
Contrasting them with men as little piglets, biologically driven to go out and hunt giraffes. It's the same kind of thinking, just maybe slightly updated language. Biological essentialism used to keep traditional roles in place.
It's a depressingly consistent theme. Okay, so let's shift from that historical backdrop to the modern arguments. Kimmel outlines 3 main areas where today's biological explanations for gender differences usually come from.
Right. Number 1 is evolutionary theory that includes sociobiology and the newer field of evolutionary psychology.
2 is brain research, looking at brain structure, function, chemistry.
And 3 is endocrinology, focusing on sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen.
And it's important to note, as the source does, that these same areas are often used to try and explain supposed biological differences between heterosexuals and homosexuals, too, often using gender stereotypes to frame those discussions.
Okay, so let's tackle number 1, the evolutionary imperative. This really gained steam in the 1970s with sociobiology, especially Edward O. Wilson. He famously tried to apply principles from his study of insects, like ants, to explain human behavior.
Which is controversial, to say the least.
Very. His basic argument was that all creatures, humans included, are fundamentally driven by biological principles. So the temperamental differences we see between men and women, for instance, are just the result of different evolutionary pressures over time. He even predicted the social sciences would eventually just shrink into branches of biology.
Wow, bold claim. Shrink the humanities and social sciences. Okay, so a big focus for sociobiologists, and now evolutionary psychologists, is explaining differences in male and female sexuality.
The core idea is pretty straightforward. Evolutionary success means passing on your genes. So males and females, because of their different biological roles in reproduction, must have evolved different reproductive strategies to maximize that success.
And the language they use here can be a bit tricky, right? Kimmel points this out. They talk about strategies and choices, almost like genes or cells are consciously deciding things in a masculine or feminine way.
Right, it makes it sound very intentional. The idea is that the differences we observe now are the result of countless generations making evolutionarily advantageous choices. Wilson and Dawkins even said, female exploitation begins here. Culture, in this view, doesn't have much sway. Wilson said genes hold culture on a leash.
The classic example they always use is the sperm versus the egg, right? Males produce billions of tiny, cheap sperm. Females produce one large, costly egg.
Exactly. So the male strategy, supposedly, is to fertilize as many eggs as possible, maximize the output, which leads, they argue, to a natural propensity towards promiscuity.
Whereas for females, because gestation, birth, lactation is a huge investment, big cost, the strategy is to be super picky. Choose a mate who's going to provide the best resources and support for raising that costly offspring.
The journalist Anthony Lang summed it up bluntly. Women seek marriage to lock down a man's resources for their kids.
Donald Simons was a key figure here, too. He talked about fundamentally different sexual psychologies. Women have to be choosy because a bad choice is disastrously costly for them. Men, less discriminating, more aggressive, always wanting variety because their reproductive cost per encounter is tiny. He just said, look, this is what we find.
Simons argued evolution favored males easily aroused by visual cues and driven to seek sex, while it favored females who were cautious about who they had sex with and when because of the huge risks of pregnancy and the investment needed afterwards.
Okay, so the story goes, the big dilemma in human sexuality is how do these naturally monogamous-leaning females get commitment from these naturally promiscuous males?
And the female strategy to solve this. According to the theory, it's to hold out for signs of emotional commitment, promises of parental support, before agreeing to sex.
Which leads to this picture of males hardwired for predatory promiscuity and females hardwired for monogamy, linking sex with love, needing their natural reluctance overcome by chivalry.
And these arguments weren't just about sex. They were used to explain broader gender inequality, the whole separate spheres idea. E.O. Wilson claimed the hunter-gatherer division of labor men hunt, women stay home reflects a strong bias with a genetic origin. He predicted we'd still see a substantial division of labor even if society tried to be totally egalitarian.
Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox piled on, saying hunting required male bonding, male cooperation. Women's biology, like menstruation, supposedly made them unreliable partners for this, and their presence would just cause disruption and competition among the men.
Plus, women supposedly have this innate maternal instinct, so it just made evolutionary sense, they argued, for men to be out hunting and women to be home raising kids.
So different reproductive strategies lead to different evolutionary pressures, which lead to different temperaments, different personalities, different roles. That's the core logic.
And evolutionary psychology is the latest version of this. It tries to explain psychological differences, why men might seem more aggressive or controlling, why women might seem more reactive or emotional by tracing them back to these supposed evolutionary paths. Men honed skills as hunters, women were programmed to be passive from childcare.
And these supposedly deep-seated differences are then used to explain modern dating patterns. David Buss's big cross-cultural survey is often cited. He found women tend to value economic prospects in a partner, while men tend to value youth and physical attractiveness, seen as cues for fertility.
Although Kimmel points out some interesting exceptions in Buss's own data, like Indian men valuing being a provider more than women did in some very egalitarian Western countries. And maybe the most telling finding was that the #1 trait valued by both men and women across all those cultures was love and kindness.
Which kind of undermines the whole different planets idea, doesn't it? Maybe evolutionary success relies more on what we have in common.
It certainly suggests that. But evolutionary theory also gets applied, very controversially, to explain violence, especially male aggression and even rape.
David Barash's selfish genes idea is relevant here. Genes prioritize their own survival above all else.
And building on that, Barash, along with Thornhill and Palmer, made the really inflammatory claim that rape could be seen as a kind of reproductive adaptation for men who can't otherwise get dates. Barash literally said men who rape are doing the best they can to maximize their fitness. Rape as an adaptive strategy for the loser male, basically, sex by other means.
Thornhill and Palmer, in their book A Natural History of Rape, doubled down, calling rape a natural biological phenomenon that is a product of human evolutionary heritage. They frame it as women having the power to choose, and rape being the male strategy to get around that choice when they aren't chosen.
Alexander and Noonan took it even further. They suggested that as women evolved ways to obscure ovulation, making mate choice harder for males, forcing sex on unwilling females became a viable strategy. This line of argument disturbingly implies that women are programmed to hold out, but if they hold out too long, men will resort to rape.
Which sounds dangerously close to blaming the victim.
The implication is certainly troubling, whether intended or not. It shifts responsibility.
Okay, that's a heavy overview of the evolutionary arguments. Let's definitely step back now and look at the critiques. Do these arguments actually make sense? Is the evidence really there?
That's the key question Kimmel raises. They definitely have that intuitive appeal we talked about. They seem to explain things we observed and give it the weight of science. But, as the source puts it, there are just too many convenient lapses in reasoning.
One big issue seems to be working backward. You see how men and women act now. Maybe men seem more likely to separate sex and love, women less so. And then you just read that current behavior back into our genes or our evolutionary past as the predetermined cause.
Right, it's a teleological argument. It assumes the outcome was the intended goal all along. It is so because it is supposed to be so. Plus, the timescales are vast. Can millions of years of evolution really explain the specific motivations behind, say, hooking up at a party this weekend? There are usually much more immediate social and psychological factors involved.
And critics like Richard Lawton point out that many of these claims are simply untestable. How do you scientifically prove a genetic basis for something complex like religion or warfare or specific mating strategies based on hypothetical scenarios from thousands of years ago?
Stephen Jay Gould was also very critical, saying there's no direct evidence for genetic control of specific human social behavior. Robert Sapolsky puts it nicely. Genes don't cause behaviors. Sometimes they influence them. But that influence is always interacting with the environment in complex ways.
Another critique is assuming there's only one way to interpret the evidence. Cadvers and Wade offer that alternative take on parental investment. Why do parents invest so much in kids? Sociobiology says it's hardwired altruism to pass on genes.
But Tavris and Wade say maybe it's just a simpler economic calculation. You care for the young when they need it, expecting they'll care for you when you're old. That explains the behavior without needing a complex evolutionary story.
And the selective use of animal data seems really problematic too. You pick the species that fits the story you want to tell.
Exactly. Want to show males are dominant roamers, look at baboons where males leave the troop, but ignore chimps where females leave. Which sex has the evolutionary wanderlust? It depends which species you highlight. Sociobiologists tend to focus on male-dominant species. Surprise, surprise.
But what if you focused on female chimps instead? They can be incredibly promiscuous during estrus, initiating sex with dozens of males. You could easily build a story from that evidence where females are programmed for promiscuity and males maybe evolve towards monogamy to ensure parental certainty.
Or look at bonobos, our closest relatives. They're communal, egalitarian, highly sexual, using sex for bonding, including lots of same-sex interactions. Their behavior just doesn't fit the standard narrative at all. And the source makes the point that same-sex contact is common in many animal species, but you rarely see biologists arguing that proves an evolutionary predisposition to homosexuality.
Simon LeVay himself warned against those simplistic animal analogies, calling them risky at best, irresponsibly goofy at worst.
And some of the core biological claims used in these evolutionary arguments just don't hold up against actual data. The idea that menstruation is debilitating. Catherine Dalton's study on schoolgirls found most had no change or even improved test scores pre-menstruation. Only a minority did worse.
Or the supposed universal maternal instinct. History shows infanticide was common, often carried out by women. That's hard to square with an overwhelming innate drive to nurture every single offspring.
And the rape argument that it's just sex by other means for unsuccessful males completely ignores the realities of sexual violence. It's often about power, humiliation, rage, not just reproduction. Rapists often have partners, target people outside reproductive age, sometimes even murder their victims, which makes zero evolutionary sense. It doesn't explain homosexual rape or prison rape either.
So the explanation just falls apart when you look at the actual phenomenon.
Pretty much. As the source says, just because rape occurs in nature doesn't mean calling it natural explains its meaning or function in human society.
Okay, so the source does this fascinating thing where it flips the script and builds an alternative evolutionary story using much of the same biological evidence.
Right, it's a just-so story exercise to show how easily the evidence can be spun differently. Start with the same basics, sperm versus egg, reproductive strategies, parental investment, but add some other facts.
Like, human females are unique among primates in not having a clear estrous cycle. They can be sexually receptive pretty much any time, fertile or not. Why would that evolve?
And the human clitoris. Its only known biological function is sexual pleasure, no direct role in reproduction.
Plus, women's sexual desire often peaks outside their fertile window just before or after menstruation, which is the opposite of what you'd expect if sex was purely about making babies efficiently.
And crucially, paternity uncertainty. Before DNA tests, a man could never be 100% sure a child was his. A mother always knows.
So putting those pieces together, human females seem uniquely built to enjoy sex for pleasure, potentially independent of reproduction. Maybe their best evolutionary strategy for offspring survival was actually promiscuity, have sex with multiple partners, create uncertainty about paternity.
Which could secure resources and protection from multiple males, each thinking they might be the father. It requires, as the source puts it, the obliteration of his genetic material in the sense of making paternity uncertain.
Could women's evolutionary strategy be promiscuity? And the female orgasm fits here too. No reproductive function, just pleasure. Elizabeth Lloyd suggests maybe it evolved to encourage frequent mating with multiple partners, increasing that paternity uncertainty.
If males could never be sure, they might invest in protecting and providing for any potential offspring just in case. So, in this story, female orgasm is a key female strategy. And maybe the male evolutionary response was to develop ways to control female sexuality, to limit their enjoyment, to try and ensure paternity.
The Bari people in Venezuela offer a real-world example where female promiscuity is a survival strategy. Secondary fathers help provide for the child.
And that study where women's partners got more possessive near ovulation, while the women themselves fantasized more about cheating. A journalist spun it as women wanting genetic variety, men wanting certainty. Same selfish genes idea, but a completely different interpretation of who wants what.
Barbara McClintock's research on menstrual synchrony, aligning with moon cycles in pre-industrial societies, also gets mentioned. Maybe it functioned partly as birth control, but it also implies that without social controls, establishing paternity would be really difficult.
Which leads to the alternative male strategy. If females were promiscuous, males constantly investing resources in potentially non-biological offspring wouldn't be efficient for their genes. So maybe males evolved towards monogamy out of self-interest.
How would they enforce it? By demanding fidelity, inventing ideals of female chastity, refusing to marry non-virgins, creating ideologies that keep women close to home, limiting their opportunities.
And there's some logic here, too. Getting pregnant isn't easy. A consistent, faithful partner improves the odds. Guarding increases a male's chances and reduces rivals.
The point of this whole counter-narrative, as Kimmel emphasizes, isn't to say this is the true story instead of the other one.
Exactly. It's the ease with which you can use the exact same biological evidence to build completely opposite stories. That should make us incredibly cautious when someone claims biology points definitively in only one direction regarding gender roles or behaviors.
Paul Ehrlich's quote seems perfect here. Genes do not shout commands to us about our behavior. At the very most, they whisper suggestions.
A great way to frame it. Okay, let's move to the second big area, the brain. Trying to find sex differences in the brain has a really long and often, frankly, disturbing history.
Yeah, going way back. 18th century, measuring brain size. Women's brains are smaller and lighter. Must mean they're inferior.
Ignoring, of course, that brain size relative to body size doesn't show that difference. And size doesn't correlate well with intelligence anyway.
Then the late 19th century, that seemed to be the peak of trying to find brain differences between everyone, races, religions, nationalities, criminals, sexes.
Emil Durkheim, a founder of sociology no less, claimed male skulls kept developing with civilization while female skulls just stopped or even regressed.
And that a horrific quote comparing the grown-up Negro to a child, a female, and an old white person, just layering inferiority upon inferiority. These weren't scientific findings, they were justifications for prejudice.
Absolutely. Now, modern brain research is obviously way more sophisticated. MRIs, PT scans, complex chemistry. But Kimmel argues some researchers are still looking for innate, hardwired differences that are supposedly resistant to cultural influence.
And the popular science books often run with this, right? Male brain, tidier, more focused, less emotional. Female brain, left capable in certain
And
ways.
notice the framing, as the source points out. It's rarely framed as, say, the female brain being better at integrating diverse information or synthesizing emotion and thought. The difference is usually cast as a male advantage or a female deficit.
It does feel like, historically, and maybe even now, the research often just seems to find what fits the pre-existing stereotypes.
Craniology back then is a perfect case study. They knew male brains had to be superior, but they couldn't agree on how to measure it because different methods gave different results. Brain surface area favored men, brain weight relative to body weight favored women. They were scrambling for a method that gave the right answer.
And test scores, too. Early 20th century, women start scoring higher on NYU exams. So the dean says, oh, men are more intellectual, women just have better memories and try harder. Patience is a female trait, intellect is male.
Women's diligence was used against them, men's laziness excused. And when women scored higher on IQ tests in the 1920s, they literally changed the questions until men scored higher.
Unbelievable. Okay, so today, what are the main focus areas in brain research related to gender?
Kimmel highlights a few key areas. 1. Differences in how the right versus left hemispheres are used or specialized, lateralization. 2. Differences in the connecting tissue between hemispheres, the corpus callosum. And 3. The idea that men and women might use different parts of their brains even when doing similar tasks.
Let's take lateralization first. The common idea is right brain for visual spatial stuff, left brain for language. Gishman and Behan had that theory about the testosterone bath in male fetuses.
Right. They claimed this testosterone selectively attacked the left hemisphere, slowing its development, which supposedly led males to develop superior right hemisphere talents, art, music, math. So male brains were supposedly more specialized, more lateralized, while female brains were less so, more interconnected.
But the problem is scientists couldn't even agree which hemisphere was supposed to be the better one, or which sex had which specialization.
Exactly. First, the left brain was superior. Reason, logic, so men were left-brained. Then by the 70s, the right brain became the seat of genius and creativity, so suddenly men were right-brained. They kept shifting the goalposts to ensure male superiority.
And wasn't their original data on fetal brains challenged?
Yes, Ruth Blyer reanalyzed their data and found no significant sex differences during that supposed testosterone bath period.
And the degree of lateralization is also messy. Some argued female brains were more lateralized, hurting spatial skills. Others argued they were less lateralized, also hurting spatial skills.
The source basically says there's almost no solid evidence for either claim now, but the idea that women are less lateralized and it hinders spatial ability somehow persists.
Even looking at kids seems driven by finding difference. That Labarthe study on toddlers building blocks. Only a small percentage of boys could build the complex bridge, barely more than the girls.
Yet the conclusion trumpeted was, boys are better at bridge building when the data actually showed birth weight was a much bigger factor. It feels like confirmation bias.
What about using different brain parts for the same tasks?
Some research suggests this, like males using only the left hemisphere for verbal tasks while females use both. That Indiana University study listening to a novel small sample, 10 men, 10 women, found that pattern for the majority, but not all.
Which leads to those easy pop science interpretations like, see, women are right when they say husbands only half listen.
Right, but it's a tiny sample. What about the men and women who didn't fit the pattern? What if they listened to Jane Austen instead of Grisham? Would the results change? It's flimsy ground for broad conclusions.
Others argue the hemispheres are used differently qualitatively. Like, the female left brain is for communication, the male left is for analysis.
Durden Smith and Desimone suggested that. Male right brain for visual spatial, female right for nonverbal cues, intuition. Again, neat categories, but how well supported are they?
Well, what about actual cognitive abilities? Math, reading. Do brain differences explain performance differences? Most people use both sides of their brain, right?
Absolutely. And Gerald Levy, a neuropsychiatrist, flipped the script, suggesting if male brains were more lateralized, maybe they'd be at an emotional disadvantage, less able to access or vocalize feelings due to weaker connections between hemispheres.
And the big picture from meta-analyses, like Janet Hyde's work.
Huge studies, millions of people, on verbal ability. Basically no gender difference overall. Reading, writing, vocabulary very similar. On math, modest differences. Females actually outperformed males generally, except maybe among the absolute highest achievers.
But the crucial finding, again and again.
The variation within each sex is vastly greater than the average difference between the sexes. Knowing someone's sex tells you very little about their likely math or verbal skills compared to knowing other things about them.
Okay, what about the corpus callosum? the connection highway between hemispheres.
One early study on just 14 brains at autopsy claimed a part of it, the splenium, was bigger and more bulbous in women, suggesting less lateralization.
But has that held up?
No. Subsequent research, including MRI studies on living people, hasn't confirmed it. Some found no difference at all.
Yet the idea persists in popular accounts.
Yeah, Robert Poole is quoted linking that unconfirmed splenium difference to women's supposed verbal skills. Michael Gurian makes those sweeping claims about only women with boys' brains being architects and girls' brains being wired only for nurturing.
Which is just insulting to both sexes, really. Denies women's potential in some fields and men's capacity for care.
Gurian and Gray also make claims about brain chemistry, like boys having less serotonin, making them impulsive, recommending educational policies based on that, despite the huge overlap and variation within sexes.
And that claim about oxytocin during sex, making men say, "I love you," but it's just the chemical, so they don't call back, that's presented as science.
It stretches credulity. And the source even mentions outright pseudoscience, like Dan Hodgins talking about a non-existent brain part called the crocus. The fact that someone peddling complete fiction gets invited to speak shows how desperate some people are for biological explanations, hence the satirical Dr. Alfred Crocus Award for the misuse of neuroscience.
But sometimes real science points in unexpected directions, like the amygdala, involved in emotion.
Right, it's somewhat larger in males, more connections, maybe linked to different stress reactions. That German study on Degas pups found separation stress raised serotonin in males, but lowered it in females, making females seem more anxious.
Which could be spun as a biological reason for higher female depression rates.
BOT, Kimmel stresses, that completely ignores culture. How are boys and girls taught to express distress? Girls often encouraged to be quiet, withdraw. Boys may be given more leeway to act out, be aggressive.
So the diagnosis rates might reflect cultural norms about expressing emotion, not just underlying brain chemistry.
Exactly. And even when real structural differences are found, like in gray matter versus white matter ratios.
UC Irvine's study found males had more gray matter, females more white matter. But Simon Baron-Cohen found the opposite for white matter volume.
Right. Scientists disagree even on recent findings. But crucially, most scientists involved insist these structural differences don't translate into differences in general intelligence. The parts might be different, but the overall cognitive output isn't necessarily affected in a predictable way.
So Doreen Kimmer's point stands. Similarities far outweigh differences.
And Jonathan Beckwitz's crucial caveat. Even if we find differences, we currently have no way to definitively link a specific brain structure difference to a specific complex behavior or aptitude. The connection just isn't there.
So why the persistence? Why keep inventing differences if they don't exist or don't matter much? Marcel Kinsborn's quote seems key.
Yeah, he suggests it's almost a backlash against feminism, a determination to find difference, perhaps because the idea of fundamental similarity is somehow threatening to the status quo. If sex differences do not exist, then they have to be invented.
A really provocative thought. Okay, third area, hormones, endocrinology. This focuses on sex differentiation during fetal development and puberty.
Right. Genes and hormones guide primary sex characteristics in the fetus. Then puberty brings that hormone flood, driving secondary characteristics.
Research here tries to link hormones, especially testosterone, to things like aggression. And it often looks at cases of hormonal anomalies during development to try and understand typical gender identity formation.
Stephen Goldberg's view is the extreme essentialist take. Men and women differ hormonally. Therefore, patriarchy and male dominance are universal and inevitable. The hormonal renders the social inevitable. Feminism is a doomed war with nature.
We touched on Geschwin and Behan's testosterone bath theory earlier, the idea that this early fetal hormone exposure is critical for male differentiation and brain development.
But the broader implication is that these prenatal hormones basically set your gender identity, your degree of masculinity or femininity in stone very early on. Testosterone is cast as the key driver of masculinity, the biological root of aggression and violence.
But we need to remember the huge variation, right? Men average more T than women, but the ranges overlap significantly.
Absolutely. Some women have higher T than some men. Correlation studies do link T to things like muscle mass, baldness, even self-confidence. But the claims often get wildly inflated,
leading to things like testosterone patches marketed as masculinity boosters, playing on men's anxieties.
Yeah, treating low T almost like a disease needing a chemical fix. The link between T and aggression is central here. Superficially, it seems clear. Men have more T, are more aggressive. Boost T, aggression can increase. Reduce T, aggression can decrease in animal studies.
But Sapolsky's monkey study throws a wrench in that simple picture.
Totally. Giving extra T to that mid-ranking monkey made him more aggressive, yes, but only towards those already beneath him. He didn't challenge the dominant males.
So T wasn't causing aggression out of nowhere. It was exaggerating the aggression that was already there, directed in socially learned ways.
Right. Scientists call it a permissive effect. T facilitates or enables existing aggression patterns. This doesn't necessarily create them. And crucially, T levels can also be a result of aggression and winning.
Theodore Kemper's work showed that winning competitions, tennis, wrestling, caused T levels to rise. Losing caused them to drop. The experience of success and status change affected the hormones, not just the other way around. And this happens in women too.
Recent studies make it even more complex. A Finnish study. No T difference between violent and non-violent men overall. But among the violent men, higher T correlated with more hostility. Again, permissive effect. Another study found men with low T were actually angrier and more aggressive. Sapolsky concluded T is vastly overrated.
What about marriage and fatherhood supposedly lowering T?
Some studies show a small effect. The Boston study found unmarried men had slightly higher T than married men, especially those heavily involved in childcare.
But the differences were tiny, inconsistent, sometimes only seen in evening samples.
Exactly. Yet people leap to conclusions. Fathers are opting out of masculine competition. It's adaptive for them to be less irritable. But maybe involved fathers are just stressed and tired, and stress lowers T. You can't build a grand theory on such shaky findings.
The popularity of T prescriptions for andropause shows that cultural desire for a simple biological fix again.
For sure. Another area is studying hormonal anomalies. The idea is that looking at individuals born with atypical hormonal profiles can give clues about normal development. The Money and Earhart study on girls with AGS, androgenital syndrome, is famous.
These are genetically female individuals exposed to high levels of male hormones in utero, born with ambiguous genitalia, had surgery, received cortisone treatment.
Money and Earhart found these girls exhibited more tomboy behavior, liking rough play, cars over dolls, prioritizing careers. Others jumped on this as proof that prenatal androgens shape temperament.
But Anne Fausto-Sterling's critique, cited by Kimmel, points out huge flaws.
Massive flaws. No proper controls. Cortisone itself is powerful. The surgery was traumatic. Data was just based on interviews, no objective observation. And they completely ignored alternative explanations like how parents might treat a child they perceive as different, or the child's own reaction to looking different or undergoing surgery.
Similarly, boys exposed to high estrogen prenatally were found less active, but their mothers were chronically ill. Maybe the boys just learned to be quiet.
It highlights how easy it is to see what you expect to see and ignore other factors. On the female side, PMS, premenstrual syndrome, gets a lot of attention.
Mood swings, anger, sometimes cited as proof of hormonal volatility, making women unfit for certain roles. It's even been used as a legal defense.
Yeah, the politics echo the testosterone debates. That physician arguing women can't handle finance because of raging hormonal influences.
But Gloria Steinem had that brilliant observation.
Right. During the time associated with PMS symptoms, estrogen is at its lowest. Hormonally, women are actually most similar to men at that point in their cycle.
Which leads to Kimmel's satirical thought experiment.
Yeah.
Maybe the solution is to have everything run by gay men, low T, immune to PMS. It totally flips the usual biological determinism.
It certainly exposes the absurdity of some of those arguments. Okay, this leads us nicely into that really contentious area, the search for biological origins of sexual orientation, the gay brain, or gay gene.
Kimmel frames this as fascinating, partly because it connects back to sex differences. Our culture often understands homosexuality through gender stereotypes. Gay men aren't real men, lesbians aren't real women, homosexuality as a kind of gender disorder.
Historically, homosexuality as a distinct identity only emerged in the late 19th century. Before that, the behaviors existed, but not the idea of being defined by them. Early on, it was often linked to this idea of interior androgyny. Even Freud saw male homosexuality as linked to effeminacy, lesbianism to masculinity, though he attributed it more to socialization.
Modern biological research tries to find something innate, irreducible. And often, the source argues, researchers seem to find what they expect. That gay men's brains or hormones look more like straight women's than straight men's, science seemingly validating stereotypes.
Dorner back in the 70s claimed gay men had a female differentiated brain due to prenatal androgen issues.
But Simon LeVay's 1991 study is the really famous one. He was specifically looking for a cellular basis for homosexuality in the brain.
He compared brain tissue from deceased gay men, mostly died of AIDS, straight men, some died of AIDS, and straight women. He looked at the hypothalamus, a region involved in sexual behavior.
And he found a difference in one tiny part, right? E02. Said it was twice as large in straight men as in women and gay men.
Yes, that was the finding that grabbed headlines. But Kimmel details serious problems. LeVay admitted difficulty measuring the area accurately. There was overlap in the data. Some gay men had large areas, some straight men had small areas.
And the AIDS factor seems huge. All the gay men died of AIDS, which affects the brain and lowers T, potentially shrinking that area. Plus, their brains were preserved differently.
Right, different formaldehyde strength. So was he measuring a real difference or the effects of AIDS and preservation chemicals? A later attempt to replicate his findings failed.
Other studies have looked too. A Dutch study found a brain difference in male transsexuals, making them look more like women, but it wasn't linked to sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Gay and straight men were similar in that study. And again, hormone treatments could be a confounding factor.
A Swedish PIC scan study exposed people to hormone-derived scents. They found gay men's hypothalamus reacted to male scents similarly to how straight women's did, and straight men reacted strongly to female scents.
Cue the gay brain found headlines.
Predictably, but the researchers themselves cautioned. Cause or consequence? We don't know. And they didn't study lesbians.
Another study found lesbians' inner ear emissions were intermediate between men's and straight women's, but found no difference between gay and straight men. It's all very inconsistent.
As Mark Breedlove said, finding a structural difference doesn't tell you how it got there. Genes, environment, behavior, we just don't know.
Then there's the search for the gay gene. Twin studies are key here, comparing identical monozygotic and fraternal dizygotic twins.
The logic. Identical twins share 100% genes, fraternal share 50%. If homosexuality is genetic, identical twins should have a much higher concordance rate, both being gay.
An early study claimed 100% concordance, which sounds too good to be true.
Exactly, widely doubted. The more famous Bailey and Pillard study recruited gay men with twins or adoptive brothers through ads. They found about 52% concordance for identical twins, 22% for fraternal, 11% for adoptive brothers.
Which was widely seen as strong evidence for biology.
It was. But Kimmel highlights the critiques. The sample wasn't random, it came from gay publications. It didn't control for environment twins share environments more closely than other siblings. And if it's purely genetic, why only 52% concordance for identical twins? Shouldn't it be closer to 100%?
The fact that fraternal twins had double the rate of other biological brothers also suggests environment plays a big role, since they aren't genetically more similar than regular siblings.
Right. The source argues the most interesting thing might be how low the concordance is for identical twins. Genes plus shared environment still only leads to similarity about half the time.
Family studies show it clumps. Gay men are more likely to have gay brothers than straight men are, but that doesn't prove it's genetic versus environmental.
And significantly, that pattern didn't hold for women in those studies. Lesbianism didn't seem to clump in the same way. Suggests maybe different factors are at play for male and female sexual orientation.
And that study debunking the opposite-sex twin hormonal link concluded early childhood gender stereotyping was a better predictor. Predicting orientation from hormones was like predicting penis size from shoe size.
A very clear dismissal of that particular biological claim. Okay, another angle Kimmel explores is research on individuals born with ambiguous sex characteristics, sometimes called intersex or historically hermaphrodites. These cases are seen as potentially revealing about development.
The famous Dominican Republic study focused on individuals with 5-alpha reductase deficiency, genetically male, XY, but born-looking female due to a hormone processing issue.
Raises girls. But then at puberty, a surge of testosterone caused masculinization. Voice deepened, muscles grew, tests descended.
And the striking result, almost all of them transitioned to live as males, became men, took male jobs, married women.
The researcher, Imperato McGinley, saw this as proof of hormones overriding upbringing. Prenatal T created a male brain that was activated at puberty.
But Kimmel emphasizes the crucial cultural context.
Absolutely. These villages knew about this condition. They had names for these individuals, Gabadonch, Machiembra. While maybe teased initially, the community was reportedly very supportive after the transition to male roles.
So an alternative view is that because the culture had seen this happen for generations, gender was maybe less rigidly fixed. They had a script for this kind of change. Anthropologist Gabbard Hurt calls these gender polymorphic cultures.
Contrasting with gender dimorphic cultures like the US, where the expectation is you're one sex, fixed for life. And you have to ask, in a culture where being male carries so much more privilege, would anyone raised female choose to stay female if they suddenly developed male characteristics and could transition? Would the transition be as smooth if it went the other way, male to female?
That survey of junior high kids is chilling in that context. Girls could imagine being boys, doing boy things. Boys contemplating being girls. The most common answer was, kill myself.
It speaks volumes about the perceived value and limitations associated with being female in that cultural context.
Which leads us right into the politics of all this, the politics of biological essentialism. Historically, these arguments have mostly leaned conservative, right?
Overwhelmingly. They suggest social inequalities are just natural, inevitable outcomes of biology. So any attempts to change things, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, are fighting Mother Nature.
James Dobson arguing the husband must be the leader, assigned by nature. Stephen Goldberg saying patriarchy is inevitable. Feminism is a war with nature. Women should stick to their physiological imperatives.
Goldberg argues men are naturally driven to protect women, and feminists foolishly want to give that up by competing on male terms. Unequal arrangements are ordained by nature.
But Cynthia Fitches-Epstein asked the obvious question. If male dominance is so natural, why does it need constant enforcement through laws, customs, violence? And why do women want to enter male domains if they're biologically unsuited?
It's a powerful critique, but here's the twist Kimmel highlights. Sometimes essentialism comes from surprising corners. Some feminists have embraced biological arguments, claiming unique female strengths, intuition, emotion linked to brain differences or mothering experiences. Alice Rossi argued women have a biological head start in nurturing.
And the politics around the biology of sexual orientation are even more complex and shifting.
Definitely. Some gay activists embrace the born this way argument, using research like LeVay's or the twin studies as a political strategy. If it's biological, not a choice, maybe it reduces stigma, undercuts moral objections.
Bailey and Pillard thought their study was good news for gay rights. Newsweek said it could make being gay like being left-handed. LeVay hoped homophobia would fade.
But the irony. Many conservatives who usually push biological determinism for gender roles suddenly became social constructionists about sexual orientation. It is a choice, said Quayle and Ashcroft. The wrong choice.
Which fuels the whole conversion therapy movement.
Exactly. And many gay activists and scholars are wary of the essentialist strategy, too. John D'Amelio asked if I can't help it is really a strong position to demand rights from.
Plus, the biological defect argument can easily be turned against you, suggesting prenatal screening cures.
Yeah.
LeVay acknowledged that risk. James Watson's horrific comment about aborting potentially gay fetuses shows the danger.
Kimmel argues this whole debate often misses how gender itself organizes the way homosexuality is understood, even in the biological research. Gay men are often framed as having female brains or hormones, gender inversion, neurological third sex.
It positions straight men as the norm, implicitly.
And it ignores the social organization of sex. Kimmel argues that gay men's and lesbians' actual sexual behaviors, who, what, where, when, how often, tend to conform more to broader gender norms than they deviate.
Gay men's sexuality patterns often look like straight men's, except partner gender. Lesbian sexuality patterns often look like straight women's. Gender seems to be the stronger organizer than sexual orientation itself.
Which might explain survey findings. Gay men are much more likely to believe they were born this way than lesbians are. Lesbians more often see it as socially constructed or chosen.
What's the difference? Vera Wisman suggested gay men, being male, have potential access to male privilege. If their homosexuality is biological, maybe society can overlook it, and they can still claim their masculine status.
Lesbians, doubly marginalized as women and non-heterosexual, might see their identity as more tied to social factors, maybe even as a political choice against patriarchy, like Charlotte Bunch argued. Seeing it as chosen can be empowering in that context.
Fascinating distinction.
Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground on biological arguments about gender. What's the big takeaway from a social science perspective, according to Kimmel?
Well, it seems biologists might often have it backward. It's not necessarily that innate biological differences directly cause all the social inequalities we see.
Instead, it might work the other way around more often. Gender inequality, the different ways we raise boys and girls, the different expectations and opportunities.
Yes.
These things, over time, can actually create observable differences in behavior, attitudes, even biology.
That darkroom analogy is perfect. Raise someone in the dark, their eyes adapt. When they struggle in the light, you don't assume a genetic defect. You understand its environmental adaptation. Our social environment shapes us deeply.
And there are major problems with how biological findings get extrapolated. That anthropomorphic hyperbole, genes demand instant gratification. Genes don't demand anything. They influence complex systems interacting with environment. A decision about sex isn't just genes firing.
Right. And assuming causation always flows from biology to psychology is flawed. Correlation isn't causation. Ruth Hubbard's analogy. Dress half the kids in skirts and tell them not to be active, half in jeans and encourage climbing. Feed them differently, give them different shoes. Over time, they'll become biologically different. Bone density, muscle development. Social practices produce biological outcomes.
So what can we say about biology's role?
Biology provides the raw materials, the basic building blocks. But it's culture, society, our experiences, our choices that assemble those blocks into the complex reality of our gendered lives.
Robert Padgug said biology is the necessary precondition, but it's always mediated and transformed by human social reality.
Richard Hofstadter's critique of social Darwinism back in 1944 still rings true. You can't reduce society to biology. Social progress comes from social organization and technology, not breeding. We judge social phenomena by their social consequences, not biological myths.
And we have to be wary of that reductionist science Troy Duster warned about. That study showing people find explanations more convincing just because they include irrelevant neuroscience jargon is alarming.
It shows how easily we can be swayed by the appearance of scientific certainty, especially when it confirms differences we might already expect or want to believe in. Is there a gene for gullibility? Probably not. But the desire for simple biological answers is strong.
So scientists will keep debating, but we have to remember context. People behave differently in different cultures. Similar behaviors can mean different things.
Americans, Kimmel suggests, seem particularly drawn to biological explanations for gender. Even when acknowledging the shaky evidence, like that Newsweek article, the conclusion often lands softly on it's both nature and nurture.
But the final emphasis in the source, and from that Newsweek conclusion too, seems important. No matter what nature deals us, it is we, our choices, our sense of identity, our experiences in life, who make ourselves what we are.
And how we make ourselves, how we navigate those experiences and choices within our social world, that's really the realm of sociology, psychology, anthropology. Biology provides the stage, maybe some props, but the play itself is written by culture, society, and individual lives.
Okay, so to recap this deep dive, the evidence for purely biological explanations for gender difference and inequality often seems compelling, but when you dig into it, it's frequently flawed, contradictory, based on selective data, and can be interpreted in completely opposite ways.
Right. What society wants to believe often seems to shape the science itself. And many differences we see might actually be the result of social inequality, not the cause.
In future deep dives, we'll keep exploring Kimmel and look more closely at those social factors, culture, family, institutions, and how they shape gender.
So the final thought for you, listening. Given how easily science about difference can be influenced by belief, how should you approach new claims about biological destiny, whether it's gender or something else? What really stood out to you from this discussion of nature versus nurture? We hope it encourages you to keep questioning and thinking critically.